So in today's video, I am going to talk about how to optimize your Blender scenery and how to optimize your render times to get the best quality frames in the fastest time possible. So I'm using this scenery where I've modeled this car, and it's a pretty good scenery to show you exactly what the differences are in different render settings and why I think that most YouTube tutorials actually fail to give you a good perspective of what the render settings should be. So the render settings that I'm going to be using are something that are very different from what most people will tell you. For example, the max bounces or the light tree options that I use. But in general, this scenery, the reason why I'm picking this up is because this scenery is complicated and it will show you a very good perspective of how different render settings actually affect the scenery. So this is a very complicated scenery where there are multiple light sources and multiple reflections, and most YouTube tutorials, when they give you settings, they don't actually give you a very good perspective of anything, that what the changes will be when you actually make those settings. Anyways, if you are keeping the scenery indoors, then I would recommend you keep this light tree option turned on. If you turn it off, it's gonna make your render faster, but it's also going to decrease the quality of actual reflections. I'm gonna show you my hardware as well. It's a laptop 3060 GPU. The reason why I'm using this is because I'm showing you that it's not a very beefy hardware. It's not a bad one either, but it's not the best one either. So, and the 3060 is also a very popular graphics card, so this is one of the major reasons why I picked this hardware. But yeah, in case of my render settings, as you can see, I have turned on the light tree. The viewport noise threshold that I have kept is 0.15 and max samples are only 200. Now usually I don't like to keep max samples anything more than 200 in viewport, but in final render settings, if you can see, I have actually kept the noise threshold to a very ridiculously low number, 0.001. I will tell you the reason why I have kept this noise threshold so low and why most YouTube tutorials who tell you to keep the noise threshold higher are actually not guiding you the right way. The thing is, if you increase the noise threshold, the actual final image is going to be very noisy. Something that most generic YouTube videos do is that they make you go high with the max sample, something like 4000, and they will also tell you to increase the noise threshold to something like 0.1 or 0.5. This will increase your render times, which I will show you by rendering the frame, but it will also decrease the quality of your actual frame by a huge margin. And the reason why I'm saying this is because indoor scenery where there are multiple light sources like this one, and especially when you have volumetric lighting in your scenery, having too much of high samples with a very high noise threshold is not going to work, because the denoiser will have to do a lot of job to actually get the scenery fixed. And so what I suggest instead is to keep the max samples to something lower, like 550, which is the most accurate number that I use, and then keep the noise threshold to something extremely low, like 0.001. Now, so for this type of render, if I'm using the settings that most YouTube videos say, you can see the frame is rendering pretty fast, right? But after it's rendered, you can see, just wait a little while. So now, as the scenery is rendered, you can see that the reflections and the actual scenery doesn't look as good. So if you were to look at on a mobile phone, then yeah, it's gonna look just as good. But if you look closely, the reflections are very distorted and the scenery doesn't look as good. And so that is where I think these settings actually fail. Most YouTube videos will give you these exact settings. And so what I suggest instead is to keep your noise threshold to something actually very ridiculously low, something like 0.001. And you will keep the max samples to something very low as well, something like 250 to 550. And I will also tell you why I'm using this range of 50s. There's something that's in Blender that actually decreases or increases the quality of frames when you keep the actual max samples in the range of 50s. So I would suggest you do that. And now if I render the final frame, which I will speed up now, Now looking at the quality of this frame, you can already see that the reflections and the actual lighting look much nicer. Even on a small screen it will look much better, and anything in the background is also gonna look much cleaner. So this is the final render setting. You have to keep the noise threshold to something like 0.001 and then increase the max samples, decrease the max samples to something like 550. 550 is the maximum amount of samples that you will need. If you are using a scenery that's outdoors, then you can actually go even lower with the samples, and since your max samples amount is very low, your scenery will not take a lot of time to render out. Now just to give you a perspective, this frame did take me around 8 times more time than the first frame. And so yeah, the setting that other YouTube videos give you, which is a setting of 4000 max samples and 0.1 noise threshold, that does work, but it renders your frame faster at the cost of the quality of frame being decreased at a very huge amount. So ultimately it comes down to you. What's your purpose? So like, if you really want the scenery to look good, then you can use the settings given on the left. But if you really want the frames to be rendered as fast as possible, then you can use the settings on the right. But in either way, I would still suggest you to use the settings that I am suggesting you, because they give you the best quality frames in the least amount of RAM possible. So this is how you will optimize your Blender scenery. Now another way of actually optimizing your final render time is actually to export your whole 3D scenery into Unreal Engine and then render it there with Lumen Engine, because Lumen is like 30 or 40 times faster. But that is something that for which you will have to actually learn Unreal Engine, at least the basics of it. So yeah, that's one way to optimize your render time, I guess. But yeah, in general, if in Blender you are going to optimize the scenery, you can use these settings that I have given you here. Do remember that your max light bounces also actually impact your scenery's render time. So if you want, you can decrease your max total bounces to something like 6. I would not recommend you to go anything lower than that, because that will decrease the quality of reflections significantly. But yeah, that was the video for optimizing your Blender scenery. I hope you liked the video, and if you did like it, consider subscribing, and I will see you on the next one.